You have taken down our entire SaaS platform. This is federal sabotage, Frank. You are going to federal prison." Ryan was screaming into my phone, his voice cracking and vibrating through the speaker. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, looking out at the quiet morning on my porch. "I did not touch your servers, Ryan. I just stopped leasing my personal domain to your company. To understand how a $15 million medical billing company went dark on a Tuesday morning, you have to go back 15 years. Back then, CoreScribe was not a sleek office in downtown Los Angeles with glass walls and free kombucha. It was just me and Richard Caldwell, sitting in a sweltering garage in Pasadena, surrounded by cheap IKEA desks and the loud hum of 3 custom-built tower servers. Richard was a brilliant medical billing specialist who had spent 2 decades watching hospitals struggle with paper claims. He had the domain knowledge, and I had the coding skills. I spent 80 hours a week writing the original PHP and MySQL backend, surviving on cold pizza and cheap energy drinks. We were building a platform to automate insurance claims for local clinics, trying to cut down processing time from weeks to seconds. In those early days, we had no money. We did not have a registered corporation, we did not have a business bank account, and we certainly did not have a corporate credit card. When it came time to launch our first beta version, we needed a web address. Richard only had cash and a personal checking account with less than $3,000 left. So, I did what any developer would do. I opened my personal Namecheap registrar account, pulled out my own Capital One credit card, and bought the domain CoreScribe.com, along with a few variations. I paid $99 for a 10-year registration. A year later, we landed our first major angel investment of $100,000. We officially incorporated CoreScribe Inc. Richard, suddenly surrounded by lawyers, wanted to transfer the domain ownership to the new corporation. But a lawyer friend of mine, Sarah Jenkins, gave me some solid advice. She told me not to sell the domain outright for $100. Instead, she suggested I lease it to the company. Richard did not mind. We signed a formal domain lease agreement in 2011. Clause 9.4 of that contract was simple. CoreScribe leased CoreScribe.com from me for a symbolic fee of $1 per year. The only major condition was that the company had to reimburse all annual registrar and renewal fees through my monthly expense reports. More importantly, the contract stated that if my employment was terminated without cause, the company had 10 business days to buy out the domain ownership from me for a flat fee of $350,000. If they failed to pay the buyout, or if they failed to reimburse the registrar fees, the lease would automatically terminate, and I retained the sole legal right to shut down DNS delegation. For 14 years, that contract sat in a dusty filing cabinet, forgotten by everyone except me. The company grew rapidly. We went from serving 3 local dental clinics to processing millions of billing transactions for major hospital networks across California. We migrated our entire infrastructure to Amazon Web Services, setting up virtual private clouds, autoscaling EC2 instances, secure RDS databases, and Route 53 DNS routing. The company was now bringing in $15 million in annual recurring revenue. My role evolved too. I became the principal cloud infrastructure architect. I knew where every legacy system was buried. I knew why the old routing tables were configured the way they were, and I managed the delicate database schemas that the younger, fresh-out-of-college developers were too afraid to touch. My salary was a comfortable $185,000 a year, and I had 50,000 restricted stock units, or RSUs, scheduled to vest in exactly 2 weeks. Those stocks would have secured my early retirement. Then, Richard Caldwell had a stroke. He survived, but his doctor told him he had to step down immediately. The board of directors brought in his nephew, Ryan Caldwell, to take over as the new CEO. Ryan was 32, wore tailored slim-fit suits, and had a master's degree in business administration from a mid-tier school. Unlike Richard, who built the company on relationships and engineering stability, Ryan was under intense pressure. A private equity firm called Granite Capital had recently acquired a minority stake and placed strict debt covenants on our funding. If Ryan did not reduce our operating expenses by 20% before the end of the fiscal quarter, Granite Capital had the right to call in their loans, which would push the company into bankruptcy. To execute this aggressive cost-cutting, Ryan hired Emily Vance as our new HR director. Emily was a rigid bureaucrat who had spent her career executing mass layoffs at logistics companies. She did not understand the value of historical engineering knowledge. To her, every employee was a line item on a balance sheet. During our first departmental review, Ryan sat at the head of the conference table, flipping through a spreadsheet of employees' salaries. He stopped at my name. He looked at my $185,000 salary, then at the column showing my 50,000 RSUs vesting in 14 days. "Why are we paying a legacy engineer this much money just to maintain things?" Ryan asked, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Everything is already automated in AWS. The infrastructure runs itself. Emily has already found an offshore agency in Eastern Europe that can handle cloud maintenance for a third of this cost." I sat across from him, keeping my voice calm. "It is automated because I spent 15 years building it to be automated, Ryan. And when something breaks at 3 in the morning, an offshore team working on a 6-hour delay won't know which legacy API is causing the database deadlock." Ryan smiled a condescending smirk. "We live in a modern tech world now, Frank. Nobody is irreplaceable." That was the moment I realized my 15 years of loyalty meant absolutely nothing. Ryan and Emily were already looking for a way to get rid of me, and they had no intention of letting me walk away with my 50,000 shares of stock. 3 days after our review, Emily Vance called me into her office. The room smelled of expensive lavender and cold corporate authority. On her desk sat a single manila folder. She did not ask me to sit down. She simply handed me a document titled Performance Improvement Plan. I looked at the targets. They were laughably impossible. I was required to reduce our AWS cloud spend by 50% while simultaneously increasing system scalability to handle a 40% surge in daily medical billing transactions, all within 7 calendar days. In the tech industry, a PIP is not a tool for improvement. It is a corporate execution warrant with a paper trail. It is designed to create a documented history of failure so the company can fire you with cause, avoiding unemployment claims, severance payouts, and legal disputes. I looked up at Emily. "This is not a plan to improve my performance, Emily. This is a checklist to justify my termination. Cutting our AWS infrastructure costs by half in a week would require shutting down our staging environments and terminating our database replication. It would leave us with no disaster recovery plan and violate our security compliance protocols." Emily did not blink. Her face remained a perfect professional mask. "We expect our high-salaried leaders to deliver high-level results, Frank. If you feel you cannot meet these standards, we can discuss your departure today." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I took a pen, signed the acknowledgement of receipt, and walked back to my desk. I knew how the game was played. In California, employment is at will, but to deny my 50,000 RSUs, they needed a documented reason to fire me with cause. They were building their case, and I needed to build mine. Over the next 7 days, I worked my regular hours. I did not try to meet the impossible metrics. Instead, I spent my time documenting every system architecture decision I had made over the last decade. I exported database schemas, backup schedules, and API endpoint configurations to secure, offline storage. I wanted to make sure that when I walked out, the operational knowledge walked out with me. On the 8th morning, my Slack account suddenly went offline. A red error message popped up. "Your account has been deactivated." 2 minutes later, my desk phone rang. It was Emily's assistant, asking me to come to the executive conference room. I grabbed my jacket and walked in. Ryan and Emily were already sitting there. Between them was a stack of papers and a cardboard box. Ryan did not waste time. "Frank, we have reviewed your performance over the last week. Unfortunately, you failed to meet the critical targets outlined in your PIP. Also, we had a database lag incident on Tuesday afternoon that caused a delay in processing claims for our primary client, United Health Partners. Our team traced it back to a server patching delay under your direct supervision. It was a lie, of course. The database lag was caused by a routing error on a third-party payment gateway, which I had already documented and resolved. But Ryan did not care about the facts. He needed a scapegoat. Due to this gross negligence," Emily said, her voice dropping into a rehearsed clinical tone, "we are terminating your employment with CoreScribe Inc. immediately. With cause. Those two words meant they were refusing to pay me any severance. It also meant that my 50,000 RSUs, which were set to vest in exactly 7 days, were immediately forfeited back to the company pool. Ryan's spreadsheet was clean. He had just saved the company nearly $1 million in equity and salary. Ryan slid a stapled document across the table. However, Frank, because of your long history with the company, we want to offer you a way out. If you sign this release waiver today, we will convert your termination into a voluntary resignation. We will also grant you a 1-month salary payout as a gesture of goodwill. I picked up the document and skimmed through it. It was a standard, sweeping release of liability. It stated that by signing, I waived all rights to sue the company for wrongful termination, age discrimination, or unpaid wages. But as my eyes scrolled down to Clause 14, the intellectual property section, I noticed the broad, sweeping language. The employee transfers and assigns all rights, titles, and interests in any intellectual property, patents, trademarks, or digital assets created or used during their tenure at CoreScribe to the company. They had used a generic corporate template. They wanted to make sure I could not claim ownership of any code I had written. But they had no idea that this clause was also trying to quietly swallow CoreScribe.com, the domain name I had registered under my personal name before the company even existed. I put the document down, slid it back across the table, and looked Ryan dead in the eye. I won't be signing this. Ryan's brow furrowed. His corporate charm slipped, revealing a flash of genuine anger. If you don't sign, Frank, you walk away with nothing. No severance, no stock, and a terminated for-cause mark on your record. Good luck finding another job at your age with that on your resume. I stood up, adjusting my collar. I'll take my chances, Ryan. Emily stood up too, gesturing to a security guard waiting outside the glass door. Security will escort you to your desk to pack your personal belongings, Frank. Your company laptop and security badge must be handed over immediately. 10 minutes later, I was walking through the lobby carrying a single cardboard box containing my mechanical keyboard, a few old notebooks, and my favorite coffee mug. The security guard walked me all the way to the glass doors of the building. As I walked out into the bright California sun, the guard looked at me with a bit of sympathy. Sorry it ended this way, Frank. I smiled at him. Don't worry, Marcus. It is just the end of a lease. I got into my truck, turned on the engine, and drove home. I did not feel angry. I felt incredibly calm. Ryan and Emily thought they had just played a brilliant hand of corporate chess. They thought they had saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars by throwing away an old, expensive engineer. But they had forgotten to check who owned the digital ground they were standing on. My home office is a quiet space at the back of the house, looking out over a small garden. This is where I sat the day after I was fired. Looking at my personal Namecheap dashboard, there it was, right at the top of the list, CoreScribe.com. Status: active. Expiration date: every year for the past 14 years, Namecheap would send an automated email to my personal address, notifying me that the domain was about to renew. The cost was trivial, just $120. I would pay it with my personal credit card, download the PDF invoice, and submit it as a monthly expense report to HR. It was a routine chore, so deeply embedded in the company's accounting pipeline that nobody ever questioned it. This year, I had submitted the invoice 3 days. Before Ryan fired me, I logged into my personal bank portal to check the status of my final expense reimbursement. I clicked on the transaction history. There it was, highlighted in red. Expense report 8842, rejected. The reason listed by HR was simple: employee terminated. Expense invalid. They had officially refused to pay the rent. Under Clause 9.4 of our Domain Lease Agreement, CoreScribe's legal right to use CoreScribe.com was contingent on 2 strict conditions. First, they had to reimburse all annual registrar fees. Failure to do so within 5 days of notice constituted a material breach. Second, if the company terminated my employment without cause, they had 10 business days to pay a $350,000 buyout fee to transfer the domain ownership to the corporation. Legally, they had fired me without cause, despite their fabricated PP, and by rejecting my final expense report, they had defaulted on the domain payment. The lease was legally voidable, but I had to play this exactly by the book. I needed to ensure they could not claim I sabotaged their systems. I called Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was a sharp, no-nonsense contract attorney in Pasadena who had drafted the original lease agreement for me back in 2011. I explained the situation and sent her the screenshots of my rejected expense report and my termination letter. Sarah laughed over the phone, a dry, barking sound. They really are amateurs, Frank. They think because they use a domain, they own it. Here is what we do. We send a formal notice of default and opportunity to cure. We give them exactly 10 business days to cure the default by paying the $350,000 buyout and the $120 in registrar fees. If they ignore it, the lease terminates automatically, and you are legally free to do whatever you want with your property. I drafted the letter under Sarah's guidance. It was written in cold, precise legal terminology, citing the exact sections of the California Civil Code and the terms of the 2011 agreement. I printed it out, walked to the local post office, and sent it via USPS certified mail, with return receipt requested. I addressed it directly to Ryan Caldwell, CEO, and Emily Vance, Director of HR. 3 days later, my tracking notification showed the letter had been delivered and signed for by Ryan's executive assistant. Inside the CoreScribe headquarters, my certified letter was treated as a joke. Marcus Finch, the senior enterprise account manager, who still checked in on me, texted me a few days later. He told me Ryan had laughed about the letter during a manager meeting, calling it a desperate shakedown from a disgruntled ex-employee. Ryan believed that because the company had used the name CoreScribe.com for 15 years, they owned it by default under common law trademark rights. He did not understand the difference between trademark law and domain registrar contracts, nor did he realize that a trademark does not change the routing tables of the internet. The 10 business days crawled by. I spent my time gardening, walking the dog, and sleeping 8 hours a night. I did not check my former work accounts. I did not try to log into the AWS servers. I did not touch their databases. On the 11th morning, a Monday, I woke up at 6. I brewed a fresh pot of French press coffee, sat down at my desk, and opened my browser. The grace period had expired. My bank account showed no sign of the $350,000 buyout, and my rejected expense report remained unpaid. I logged into my Namecheap account and clicked on the domain management panel for CoreScribe.com. Currently, the domain name servers were pointing to CoreScribe's AWS Route 53 servers. These records were the digital signposts telling the entire internet that any traffic going to CoreScribe.com should be sent to CoreScribe's AWS load balancers. I clicked on the drop-down menu and selected Use Namecheap Basic DNS. Next, I went to the DNS host records. I deleted the A records that pointed to the AWS servers. Instead, I created a single URL redirect pointing to a static, free GitHub Pages repository I had set up the night before. The page was a blank white screen with a single sentence in black text. CoreScribe's system is currently offline for administrative maintenance. I clicked Save Changes. Slowly, the digital signposts of the internet changed. If a client typed CoreScribe.com into their browser, their local internet provider no longer asked AWS where to send them. They asked Namecheap, and Namecheap pointed them to my blank GitHub page. The mail exchange records, which routed every email sent to the company, were deleted. The APIs that the medical clinics used to submit billing claims were hard-coded to api.corescribe.com. Those APIs now connected to a blank page, throwing immediate timeout errors. Most importantly, the Okta servers, which managed the single sign-on logins for all 120 employees at the headquarters, relied on the domain to verify security tokens. The shutdown was complete, and I had not broken a single law. I had simply stopped renting out my property. By 8:30, my phone started vibrating on my desk. The first text was from Marcus Finch. Frank, the entire system is down. None of the hospital networks can connect to the billing API. Okta is throwing DNS errors, and we cannot even log into our company Slack. The developers tried to log into AWS to check the servers, but they could not. The login page redirected to Okta, which could not resolve the authentication requests. The CTO tried to bypass the SSO by logging in through the AWS root account, but the root account was registered under the email address obusadmin@corescribe.com. To log in, AWS sent a verification link and a multi-factor authentication reset token to that specific email. But because the mail server was dead, the verification emails from AWS were bouncing back. They were locked out of their own cloud infrastructure. At 10:15, my phone rang. The caller ID showed the corporate number. I picked it up. Frank! You think you are smart? You think this is a joke? Ryan's voice was a high-pitched scream. You have shut down our entire SaaS platform. This is federal sabotage, Frank. It is a violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. I have already called our corporate legal team, and we are filing an emergency complaint with the FBI. You have 5 minutes to point that domain back, or you are going to federal prison. I waited a beat. Ryan, I did not touch your AWS servers, I said, keeping my voice steady. I did not access your network. I did not write a single line of malicious code. I simply stopped leasing my personal domain to your company because you breached our contract. You refused to pay the buyout fee, and you rejected the expense report for the domain renewal. If you rent a house and refuse to pay the rent, the landlord changes the locks. That is not sabotage. That is civil property law. Talk to my lawyer, Sarah Jenkins. Her number was in the certified notice I sent you. Have a nice day. I hung up. Ryan did not run to the FBI because his lawyers knew they had no criminal case. Instead, they ran to the Los Angeles County Superior Court. By Monday afternoon, CoreScribe's legal team had filed an emergency petition for a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction. They argued that my actions were causing irreparable harm to public health billing and threatening the company with bankruptcy due to a $500,000 per day penalty from United Health Partners, which was set to trigger if the billing endpoints were offline for more than 24 hours on Tuesday morning. Sarah Jenkins and I walked into the courtroom. CoreScribe's high-priced corporate attorney stood before the judge, waving printouts of the offline billing system. He argued that CoreScribe.com was a vital business asset, that Frank Miller was a disgruntled ex-employee holding the company hostage, and that the court must issue an immediate order forcing me to restore the DNS records. When it was Sarah's turn, she stepped to the podium. She did not raise her voice. She simply handed the judge 3 documents: the signed 2011 Domain Lease Agreement, the certified mail receipt showing Ryan had received the notice of default, and the official bank record showing HR had rejected the $120 domain renewal reimbursement. Your Honor, Sarah argued, the plaintiff is seeking equitable relief, but they come to this court with unclean hands. The contract explicitly states that, if they terminate my client without cause, they must pay a $350,000 buyout. They refuse to pay. The contract states they must reimburse the registrar fees. They rejected the expense report. They knew about this lease for 14 years, yet they chose to breach it to save money. The harm they are experiencing is entirely self-inflicted. They cannot use the power of the state to force my client to lease his private property for free when they have violated the very terms of the lease. The judge reviewed the documents, adjusting his glasses. He looked down at CoreScribe's attorney. Counsel, the judge said, an injunction is an extraordinary remedy. It requires a showing of a likelihood of success on the merits. Your client signed a contract stating that if they failed to pay the lease or the buyout, the lease would terminate. They failed to pay. They cannot claim emergency sabotage when they deliberately chose not to pay the $120 renewal fee for the asset they now claim is worth millions. The petition for a temporary restraining order is denied. This is a contract dispute, and it will be resolved through standard civil litigation. The gavel struck the desk. CoreScribe's attorney turned pale. He looked at Ryan, who was sitting in the gallery, staring in disbelief. The legal shield they had relied on had shattered. They had 18 hours before United Health Partners' contract penalty would trigger, and they had no legal way to force me to turn the system back on. By Tuesday afternoon, the courtroom defeat had sent CoreScribe into a complete tailspin. The company was facing a critical deadline. United Health Partners had officially notified Ryan that if the API endpoints were not restored by Wednesday morning, they would invoke the $500,000 per day penalty and initiate legal proceedings to terminate their multi-million-dollar contract. Ryan tried to bypass the lockout by purchasing CoreScribe Portal, and ordering the remaining developers to migrate the system. but the lead database administrator had to explain the hard operational reality. The databases, the secure SSL certificates, and the API endpoints were hard-coded to CoreScribe.com. Even if they rewrote the code overnight, United Health Partners' security compliance guidelines required a strict 30-day security audit before they would allow their servers to connect to a new domain. They had less than 15 hours left. The crisis finally broke through the corporate bubble. The CEO of United Health Partners, furious at the lack of progress, bypassed Ryan and called Richard Caldwell, the retired founder, at his home. Richard was still recovering from his stroke, but his mind was sharp and he knew the company's survival was at stake. At 4 p.m. on Tuesday, my phone rang. I picked it up and heard Richard's voice, tired but familiar. "Frank," he said, "I just got a call from the CEO of United Health Partners." He was screaming. I had to log into my old personal email to figure out what was going on. I called the board of directors. "Frank, I am so sorry. Ryan is an idiot. He did not understand the infrastructure, and he certainly did not read the contracts. How do we fix this?" I leaned back in my chair, looking out at my garden. "Richard, I built this company with you," I said. "I respected you, but your nephew and Emily Vance tried to destroy my career. They put me on a rigged PIP, fired me on a fabricated claim of negligence, and tried to strip me of my 50,000 RSUs in my severance. I am not going to let them run roughshod over my life." "I know," Richard said, his voice heavy with regret. "The board is holding an emergency meeting right now. We are going to make this right. Can you come to the office tomorrow morning at 8? "I will be there myself," I agreed. The next morning, I walked back into the CoreScribe office. The atmosphere was thick with exhaustion. The developers in the lobby looked like they had been awake for 2 days straight, their eyes red, surrounded by empty coffee cups and energy drink cans. The servers were running, but they were whispering to an empty internet. I walked into the executive conference room. Richard Caldwell was sitting at the head of the table, looking frail but composed. Ryan Caldwell and Emily Vance were sitting on the left side of the table. Ryan's tailored suit looked wrinkled, and his eyes were fixed on the mahogany table. Emily looked pale and defensive. Saw Jenkins, my lawyer, sat next to me. Richard did not waste any time. He looked at Ryan and Emily. "Before we begin, I want to inform you both that the board of directors held an emergency vote last night. Ryan, you are removed from your position as CEO, effective immediately. Emily, your contract with CoreScribe is terminated for gross mismanagement and unethical labor practices. You will both pack your offices and leave the building by noon today." Ryan looked up, his mouth opening as if to speak, but Richard raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "You almost destroyed a $15 million company in 6 months because you wanted to save a few dollars on a legacy engineer. You are done." Richard then turned to me, sliding a document across the table. "Frank, this is a settlement agreement drafted by our legal team and reviewed by Sarah." I looked at the terms. They were clear. First, CoreScribe would purchase CoreScribe.com and all related domains from my private LLC for a flat fee of $500,000, wire transferred immediately. Second, my 50,000 RSUs would be fully vested immediately, valued at approximately $400,000. Third, I would receive 6 months of salary as severance, totaling $92,500. Fourth, a mutual non-disparagement agreement and a clean letter of recommendation signed by Richard himself. Sarah looked at her laptop, then nodded at me. "The wire transfer of $500,000 has been initiated, Frank. The funds are currently verified and pending in our escrow account." I picked up the pen and signed my name. Richard signed on behalf of the board. Emily Vance was already out of the room, escorting herself to her office to pack her belongings. Ryan stood up slowly and walked out without saying a single word. His corporate career effectively over before it had even begun. I opened my personal laptop and logged into my Namecheap registrar account. I navigated to the domain management panel for CoreScribe.com. I clicked on the Name Servers tab. I deleted the Namecheap basic DNS settings and re-entered the AWS Route 53 name servers. I clicked Save. Within 5 minutes, the DNS started propagating back. The blank page disappeared. The medical billing systems resolved. The API endpoints began responding to the hospital networks, and the backlog of claims began to clear. The company's email server came back online, and the developers finally got their Slack access back. Richard stood up, shaking my hand. "Thank you, Frank, and enjoy your retirement," I smiled. "Thank you, Richard." I walked out of the building and into the parking lot. I was 48 years old. I had nearly $1 million in cash and vested stock in my account. I had spent 15 years building a system, and a $99 domain name had ended up paying for my early retirement. I got into my truck, rolled down the windows, and drove home into the California sun.